Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to what is our final WAP seminar of the fall semester. I want to just take a moment to especially thank all of the members of our audience who have joined us every week this semester. It's been wonderful to see some familiar faces, and I hope that you all learned a lot and have enjoyed this fabulous slate of speakers that we have had this fall. I know I have really enjoyed it. The Women in Public Policy program equips leaders and changemakers with rigorous evidence-based strategies to advance women and gender equity. My name is Dara Cohen, and I am Ford Foundation Associate Professor of Public Policy here at the Harvard Kennedy School, and I have had really the honor and privilege of leading the seminar series this fall. The series this fall, as you know now, has been entirely devoted to issues of gender, sex, and war. And we have now hosted, including today's speaker, 12 guests from around the world who have joined us virtually this fall. I want to again acknowledge our appreciation for the generous support provided by Carol Hamilton, who is the Women's Leadership Board member, in making today's programming possible. The Carol Hamilton Gender and Conflict Fund supports a new community here at HKS among scholars of gender, conflict, and sexual violence. Our speaker for today is the wonderful Professor Sabrina Karim, my friend and colleague and co-author, who is going to be presenting her paper titled "The Rambo Effect: The Impact of Gender on Misconduct Among Security Force Personnel," using experimental survey evidence from 4 countries. Professor Karim is an assistant professor in the Department of Government at Cornell University. Her research focuses on conflict and peace processes, and particularly on state building in the aftermath of civil war, including international involvement in security assistance to post-conflict states and gender reforms in peacekeeping and domestic security sectors. Professor Karim is currently working on 2 book manuscripts. The first is titled "When Peace Makes States: How International Security Sector Assistance Shapes Post-Conflict State Building." And she's also working on a co-authored book titled "From Gender Equality to the Status of Women: Concepts and Measurement in Peace and Conflict Studies." She is the co-author of an award-winning book titled "Equal Opportunity Peacekeeping," which my students read this week, "Women, Peace and Security in Post-Conflict Countries." It was published by Oxford University Press in 2017, and as I mentioned, was the winner of several awards. Lastly, I'll just say that Professor Karim is imminently about to launch the Gender and Security Sector Lab at Cornell University, which will conduct surveys of security force personnel around the world in order to better understand how gender shapes police and soldiers' perceptions and behaviors. Professor Karim is really one of the foremost experts on these issues, and I'm really grateful that she's able to join us today to share her cutting edge and quite policy relevant research. Before I turn the floor over to Professor Karim, I want to just lastly welcome WAP's podcast community, which has downloaded our seminars over 59,000 times. We're quite pleased to have a lasting and broad-reaching impact beyond those who are able to join our virtual seminar today. So as usual, our speaker will be presenting for 30 minutes, and then we'll have 10 minutes for Q&A from our virtual audience. We do request that you hold your questions until the end of the talk, and then for those who have a question, you will have the opportunity to be unmuted in order to ask our speaker your question out loud. We do just request that, because we have such a small amount of time for questions, that audience questions are very brief and on topic and posed in the form of a question. My colleague, Katie Ohnberg, will once again be managing the Q&A portion of the seminar. And with that, I will turn the floor over to Professor Karim. Thank you again so much for joining us today.
Great. Thank you so much, Dara, for such a generous introduction. It's really kind of you. And thank you for inviting me to be a part of this fantastic seminar. I know it's been a fantastic group of people that you've put together, so I am honored to be on the guest list. I'm just going to share my screen here and get the, okay. I think that should be working. Okay.
Perfect.
So thank you very much for having me. As you'll note, the title has changed a little bit, and you'll kind of get a sense of why that is. It's the commando effect, and not the Rambo effect, and it has to do with the difference between Arnold and Sylvester Stallone, but we'll get there in the talk. And as Dara mentioned, this paper is really the first paper that's coming out of the Gender and Security Sector Lab, which we're launching in January at Cornell University, which is a part of a broader initiative, the Elsie initiative, funded by the Canadian government, which has sought to put a lot of resources and money into trying to better understand how to increase women's participation and inclusion in peacekeeping operations, but also in security forces around the world. And so the lab is really asking a few questions in terms of the research that we're going to be doing. So we want to try to better understand how gender shapes the attitudes and behavior of security force personnel, the conditions under which women might be able to meaningfully participate in the security forces, as well as peacekeeping missions. And then what I'm going to talk about today, and something that I'm particularly interested in this lab setting, is to see how we can prime gender in terms of then assessing how, if you do prime gender and gender identities, how that leads to perceptual or behavioral changes among security force personnel. And I will talk in depth today about what I mean by gender priming. Okay, so today's paper is asking this particular question. Under what conditions do individual security personnel engage in abuse of authority? And in particular, I'm not so much in this paper looking at behavior, but rather beliefs about gender roles and beliefs about toxic masculinity, and looking at how those types of beliefs, and I'm going to go into in-depth detail about the difference between beliefs about gender roles and beliefs about toxic masculinity, how those might shape broader behavior, but then also in particular perceptions of abuse of authority, right? And so when I talk about abuse of authority, what do I mean? I am not referring to repression, defection, or disobedience. So these are common topics that come up when people study the security forces. The police are usually responsible for repression, and then in the military literature, we see some literature on defection and disobedience in the military. So I'm not referring to that kind of behavior, but rather what I'm interested in is these kinds of quotidian abuses or routine actions that go against what is sanctioned or what is authorized. So this might mean that security force personnel are making arbitrary rules on the ground. It might be unlawful action. And so some examples here are, maybe people or police officers, as we know from the summer, and in Nigeria and other places where policing has really been a topic in the news, might abuse protesters. They might drive recklessly. They might harass civilians or harass members of their own personnel, or engage in inappropriate behavior. And so these kinds of quotidian abuses really add up and affect the legitimacy of the security forces, right? And so this is really not, what I'm not talking about is when a leader asks the police force to basically, repress, right? These are individual police officers and soldiers that are making decisions on the ground. And the argument is that these kinds of actions, like I said, really add up and could delegitimize the security forces, and it also has the potential to weaken the state, especially in the eyes of particular populations. So, in the US, we can think of policing in minority communities, and how, the police are not really seen as a legitimate actor in some minority communities here in the US. Okay, so the literature talks a lot about security force abuse of authority, but the framing has usually taken on kind of a principal agent model, where you might have this difference between the principal, who in this case could be the civilian leader, and the agent being the military, and there's just a lack of information or misinformation, or misalignment in information between these two actors, and that leads to an abuse of authority. Some scholars have argued about the opportunity for abuse. So, where there is weakness already in weak institutions, those are areas where there might be more abuse of authority. your lovely professor, wonderful professor, Dara Cohen, has talked about the socialization effect in security force personnel. And there's this fantastic book by Rachel Wall that looks in depth about police abuse in India and why police officers engage in torture. And basically, she argues that there's this ad hoc justification for torture because it legitimizes the actions of a broader purpose for police officers of what they're meant to do. So, these are all great explanations, and I think that they have a lot to offer. But what is missing is really this idea about gender, right? In theorizing about this, and so that's really what I want to try to bring in. So this is not really a competing hypothesis against these other frameworks, but rather something to add on to them potentially. And what do I mean by gender? So I know you've probably had a lot of speakers talk about gender and what that means and what it doesn't mean. And so I'm going to be very specific about what I mean here. And for me, in this paper, I'm arguing that there's two components that we want to think about. So the first is kind of a more traditional understanding of gender as kind of a prioritization of the masculine identity over a feminine identity. So what do I mean by that? I mean, there's different types of gender identities. So you can identify as masculine, you can identify as feminine, or on this broad continuum. But when you do that, and in particular in some institutions, the masculine identity is oftentimes prioritized or valorized more so than a feminine identity. So there's a hierarchy of identities in a sense. And so in most institutions, in particular in the security forces, we know that the masculine identity is prioritized or valorized over a feminine identity. And then the second part of gender that I'm interested in is thinking about conformity. So this is the idea that women are expected to behave feminine and men are expected to behave masculine, and any kind of transgression is deviant, right? So if women behave in a masculine way, they're punished in some form. And if men behave in a feminine way, they are punished in some form. And the argument that I'm making in this paper is that these are two separate components of gender and that can be measured separately and have different consequences potentially. Okay, so to just recap, so the first idea of gender ties into toxic masculinity, and you may have read a number of people's work on this idea of militarized masculinity, which ties into toxic masculinity, which is basically the masculine identities that I talked about prioritize or valorize particular traits like dominance or virility or honor, and these aren't positive traits. So these are kind of negative traits, but because they're masculine, they're still valorized in particular institutions. And we know from the literature that if you hold these kinds of toxic masculine views, that's associated with authoritarian beliefs, as well as a whole host of other kinds of negative beliefs and behaviors potentially. And so if you are an institution or if you believe in or identify with these kinds of toxic masculine identities, and that is valorized within the organization, then there's potentially this association that you are going to find the abuse of authority more acceptable. So if you hold toxic masculine beliefs, right, then you might be more likely to find an abuse of authority acceptable. Now, this is different than gender roles, right? So remember, there was two components to this idea of gender. And so here, what I'm suggesting is that it's not just about holding toxic masculine beliefs about virility and dominance, honor, etc., but rather, if you hold rigid beliefs about how women are supposed to behave and how men are supposed to behave, right? We can think of gender stereotypes as another way of trying to understand gender roles. That is going to also encourage particular acceptance of abuse of authority. And so one mechanism might be that this gender roles and beliefs in gender roles creates these kinds of in and out groups. And so you're only likely to accept other people or other men usually that are conforming, and women accept women that are conforming to their particular gender role. So you have these groups that are created, and so if anybody within this in-group engages in some violation or abuse of authority, you are going to defend them because, you know, the gender conformity creates these kinds of in-groups, right? And so, you know, there's multiple mechanisms. I think in the paper I go into more details about mechanisms for gender roles, but basically the same idea applies here, is that if you hold rigid views about gender roles, then you are also going to be more likely to accept abuse of authority or find abuse of authority to be acceptable. Okay, so we have two kinds of ideas about gender beliefs. And then what I really wanted to talk about, though, is this idea of priming gender. And what I'm going to do is show you a series of pictures that are really easy to find on the internet. You just put a Google search and you can find all kinds of pictures like this, recruitment in particular for the security forces. This one is the Rhodesian army. So obviously they're trying to trigger some kind of masculine identity with this poster, right? You be a man by joining the security forces. Right, this is triggering somebody's masculinity, and this is what I'm trying to get at. It takes a man to fill it. So join the Navy. So another kind of trigger or prime that we might see from posters. And then this one is one of my favorites. So this series of photos came out in the magazine Guns and Tactics. And it's a series of photos of men that look like this. You know, white men that have beards, that are dressed in fatigues and holding some kind of a weapon. And normally, if we were in person, I would kind of ask you what this might trigger. But if you read the article, what this is meant to do is actually prime people to change their ideas about masculinity, because this article is about beards. So you might not get that from this article, but this article was all about how growing a beard is like tied into masculinity. And so if you think of like kind of a more traditional idea of what it means to be a soldier, it's actually clean shaven, right? And so these kinds of pictures are triggering a different kind of masculinity for the men, mostly men, I assume, that are reading this magazine to try to then kind of conform to. And so it's these kinds of triggers that I am interested in terms of thinking about whether or not they actually prime people's gender identities. And so in this particular paper, that's what we were trying to do with the security forces. And here again, I have another picture of another potential prime. So if you want to carry a weapon and be a real big boy, you can call any of those numbers. But what we wanted to do in the survey was to try to like invoke this kind of priming. And so we basically ended up showing people a picture of masculinity, and then we asked people to compare themselves to that, and then do kind of have this like self-reflection about their masculinity. I'll get into that into a little bit more detail in a second. But that's kind of the idea. So if gender is primed in some way, what happens? And so, just a very preliminary hypothesis is that if you are priming this kind of toxic masculinity or hypermasculinity, then it's very possible that that might lead to people finding abuse of authority more acceptable as well. Right. Okay, so what did we do? So as I mentioned, a part of the Elsie initiative and a part of the lab allows us to be able to conduct surveys with security personnel around the world. And so up to now, we have conducted surveys with the Zambia Police Service, the Ghanaian Armed Forces, the Uruguayan Police, the Uruguayan Armed Forces, and the Senegalese Police and Gendarmerie. So that's the survey data that we are using. And so this is about 1,899 individuals. We conducted 380 surveys within each institution. So we are oversampling women and people that have deployed to UN peacekeeping operations. I'm kind of happy to talk about that. That's because of the reason for doing the survey. We tried to then make it as representative as possible across rank and geography, in addition to kind of this oversample. Okay, so then in the survey, we have questions about toxic masculinity. So we have created a masculinity scale that has questions related to dominance, rape culture, virility, and honor. And these scales are adapted from previous scales that have measured hypermasculinity. And so we take kind of those elements and we tweak them to match the context. And then we also have a gender roles additive scale, which is also taken from previous kind of there's so many surveys or indices that are that try to measure gender roles. So we've looked at them all and kind of just picked the questions that made sense here. Okay, but then the treatment or for the masculinity prime, again, is also taken from the literature. And you'll note that, you know, one of the things we find is that this isn't quite the prime that we wanted, but we wanted to see how it worked, but because it's picture oriented. So basically we asked the country team, so we worked with a partner in country to try to identify what hypermasculinity looks like in the particular country, and then for them to come up with a picture. And in some countries, we showed, we thought that this picture of Arnold, and hence you'll see that the commando effect comes from Arnold. We didn't have a picture of Sylvester Stallone, so we changed the title. But in some of those countries, we included Arnold, in some of them we didn't. In some cases, we just picked what the country team suggested as being kind of the hypermasculine prime photo. And then so basically we showed them the photo. We asked them to, we asked them to rank their own masculinity first. Then we showed them the photo. Then we asked them to compare themselves to the photo, whether or not they thought that they were, in comparison to the photo, whether or not they were, you know, more masculine, less masculine, or about the same. And then we asked them to think of a time where they felt like the person in the picture. So this is the reflection about their masculine experience. So that was the treatment. And then we randomized the order that they received this. So some people got this before the questions about abuse of authority, and some people got it after. And so we have three sets of dependent variables. One is the escalation behavior. So we're interested in whether or not, given different scenarios, people escalate in the situation and use violence. So in a protest situation, theft, domestic violence, rumors of infidelity, and daughters eloping. And I should just mention here that all of these scenarios are based off of peacekeeping missions, because it was an appropriate way to ask these kinds of questions. And secondly, because the norms around what is appropriate are standard across all countries for this. So for example, you know, there might be different rules within security forces for these different behaviors within country, but they're consistent across all countries for peacekeeping. So that was a constant that we could use for measuring escalation. And then we have an index for seriousness of different taboo behavior or inappropriate behavior. So again, security forces engaging in protest violence, drunk driving, taking bribes, and engaging in sexual exploitation and abuse while on mission. We looked at whether or not people thought that these activities were serious or serious violation, and then also whether or not they would report this behavior to the authorities. And one thing to note is we also asked whether or not they knew that this was inappropriate, and across the board that was not an issue. So everyone knew that this kind of behavior was bad or wrong or against, you know, was inappropriate. So that's not what we're picking up here. Okay, and then, you know, we control for a number of things here. And I should mention, you know, for the first two hypotheses, if you remember, we're just looking at a correlation. So obviously this is not, you know, I'm not making a causal argument here by any means, but you'll note that there is going to be positive associations between the first masculinity scale. So again, this is the idea that hypermasculine beliefs about virility, beliefs about rape culture, etc. That scale that we created does lead to an increase in people's beliefs about escalating a situation, right? Again, this is a correlation. We can look at the same results for the masculinity scale in terms of the seriousness index, so whether or not certain taboo behavior was thought of as serious and whether or not they would report it. And again, holding these masculine beliefs means that people are less likely to think that it's serious, but really, like, the real effects come with the reporting. They're much less likely to think that they would report this kind of behavior. When we look at the gender role scale, again, this is all just correlation. Again, we find some evidence that if you hold rigid beliefs about gender roles, that's also potentially going to lead to people escalating a particular situation to become more violent. And then similarly, we see an effect with whether or not the taboo behavior was seen as serious and reporting. So if you hold rigid views about gender roles, you are much less likely to think that this kind of taboo behavior is serious and less likely to report it, right? Again, this is all correlation. But when we look at the priming treatment, so this is where there, mostly we have null effects here, where the prime didn't really trigger the masculinity or masculine identity for escalation. Where there is maybe a little bit of movement is with the seriousness index, and then really nothing for reporting. So, basically what we did in order to try to trigger the masculinity prime didn't quite work, or wasn't a strong enough treatment, or wasn't a strong enough prime. And so we are going back to the drawing boards a little bit about trying to figure out what is a stronger prime. And we have some ideas about what we're going to do. I'm happy to share those if people are interested. But okay, so what's the main takeaway? I should just briefly mention that because this study was really trying to understand, is oriented around peacekeeping. There is a bit of a potentially a socializing effect from UN peacekeeping deployments. So I also can talk about that if people are interested. So peacekeeping does condition beliefs about gender roles and toxic masculinity in terms of abuse of authority. Okay, so let me just conclude, because I know I want to be able to answer questions. So what does this study basically find? So again, I'm trying to develop two different indices between toxic, which are toxic masculinity and gender roles. And I should mention, I didn't mention this, they are not correlated with each other, right? So that's important because basically we're measuring and identifying two different aspects of gender that are different and that might have different effects, but are not correlated with each other. So if you hold toxic masculine views, you don't necessarily hold rigid views about gender roles and vice versa, right? So that's an important point. But holding either of these or both of these are correlated with individual security agents' willingness to engage in and condone abuse of authority, right? So if you hold these kinds of beliefs, you also are potentially more likely to see this kind of behavior that's bad or not sanctioned as appropriate. And then some limited evidence for now that these beliefs aren't necessarily primed. I don't believe that. I think that they can be primed because they're primed all the time. It's just a matter of trying to be able to identify and find the right way to prime them in the future. And that's really kind of what we're hoping to do going forward with the lab. So I'll be hiring I have 4 research fellows coming in. We're doing surveys in 4 to 12 more countries. And then, so we will be implementing a different priming treatment and then refining our questions. So I think that is it. So yes, thank you very much for your time.